Welcome to this Fathom interview. I'm Omer-Jackaman, and with me is my fellow Deputy Editor Calev Ben-Dor. We're delighted to be joined today by Dr. Einat Wilf. Dr. Wilf is a leading thinker on Israel, Zionism, foreign policy, and education. She was a member of the Israeli Parliament from 2010 to 2013, where she served as chair of the Education Committee and as a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. She's the author of 7 books, including We Should All Be Zionists. Dr. Wilf, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
We're here to talk chiefly about your essay, Zionism as Therapy, which argues that Zionism wasn't primarily a political project about creating a state, so much as a profound diagnosis of the maladies of diaspora life and a path forward to rebuild the Jewish spirit. And I'd like to start by reading a quote from the essay, which really spoke to me, I have to say, as a non-Jewish Zionist and one of the political left. It's about the importance of reading the Zionist pioneers in their own words. Mm-hmm. Quote, when reading what Zionists had to say in their own words, the toxic descriptions of Zionism as emblematic of the world's evils, from racism to genocide, melted away. Instead of a cabal of evil conspirators intent on wreaking evil in this world, these Jewish writers were desperately trying to carve a path for surviving as Jews in the modern era, end quote. It really chimes with my own thoughts and something I wrote in Fathom recently about returning Zionism to its original European context, something that's done far too infrequently in debates here. From your experience, how does this kind of contextualization will help with building resilience in the era of widespread anti-Zionism?
So in my experience, it makes all the difference in the world. When I structured the course on Zionism and anti-Zionism for Georgetown, my thinking was I'll provide in the beginning of each class some historical background, but most of the course will focus on reading primary materials, because too much of the discussion about Israel is done through people who are writing about Israel, and not enough directly listening to the people who wrote about, especially Zionism, who imagined what a Jewish state would be. And once you put it in the historical context of emancipation, in the sense of the failure of emancipation, the rise of nation states to replace declining empires, and you're beginning to understand that Jews were struggling with what all of that meant to being Jewish in the modern era. And this is an era where Jews turn everywhere. Communism is hugely attractive, and Bundism and emancipation itself is hugely attractive. And Zionism emerges at that same cauldron of ideas. And when you read the Zionists, you really just see Jews struggling with how to be Jewish in the modern era. Zionism is even the more marginal idea. At this point, emancipation is far more attractive. Communism, Bundism are hugely attractive. Immigration to America is very attractive. Zionism is very marginal, and you're really seeing thoughtful Jews struggling with what all these massive changes will mean for the Jewish people.
Absolutely. And is it that kind of knowledge, therefore, that you see as the therapy of the title of your essay, that this can help those people struggling in an environment of demonization?
Yes, because what happens is even Jews themselves often hear about Zionism through its detractors. So they are most likely to be introduced to Zionism by anti-Zionists. And that will form their primary understanding. And what anti-Zionists will generally say of Zionism is this equation with all of the world's evils. They will portray this kind of sinister force in global affairs. So for Jews to engage directly with the text, to see Zionism as it emerges against a particular historical moment, to see how Jews thought about Zionism, how they went about implementing it, my experience was that it made everything that is being said about Zionism, all the kind of the toxicity and the evil, just melt away. And what I wrote in the essay is what Zionism emerges is actually is quite normal as a movement for self-determination of a people who see everybody around them, the Slovaks and the Czechs and the Poles and the Ukrainians and the French and the Germans, everyone beginning to coalesce around the idea of self-determination, of a people governing themselves, free from empire. This is also, it's something that I often struggle to explain, that the rise of nationalism is also the rise of popular democracy, because the idea of one person, one vote really only begins to make sense to people when they do it within political communities where they feel that they share something, and therefore they can trust each other to live in a political community where everyone has equal power. So Jews are viewing all of that happening around them, and Zionism therefore emerges as a normal movement of self-determination at the time when other peoples were also rising to claim their right to govern themselves by themselves. And the opposite also happens with anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism essentially emerges as two parts, either as mostly a sadly failed idea. So this is what I would call the innocent anti-Zionisms or the Jewish anti-Zionisms. That's the Jews struggling to figure out how to be Jews in the modern world. So they think that communism will finally bring them the equality and belonging that they crave. They think that emancipation will bring it, that they will be French and German. They think that Bundism will bring it, that they will have this labor solidarity with their fellow Poles or their fellow Russians that talks about living in wherever they are rather than longing for Zion. So those are essentially innocent anti-Zionisms because, again, they're part of the Jewish search for an answer on how to be modern, how to be a Jew in the modern era. And here what emerges is merely the tragic verdict of history. That was indeed tragic to all of them, to emancipation, to communism, to Bundism. And then there's the other kind of anti-Zionism, the one that is more theological, the one that is rooted in a certain Christian theology that becomes secularized in the West, which is what we see today, that gets secularized through communism, that gets, and then we see Islamic anti-Zionism that turns into this murderous war, essentially, against the state of Israel. So the students, first of all, are able to differentiate the various kinds of anti-Zionisms, the ones that the more sinister anti-Zionists are trying to hide behind. They're trying to hide behind the innocent ones. And they also begin to notice that anti-Zionism is at its core a theological project that cannot bear to see Jews essentially stand up for themselves.
Well, we're going to draw on some of those historical examples a little more now, if that's okay. I mean, in the essay, you draw a connection between these different historical and then contemporary claims. For example, the ancient Christian theological need for Jews to remain stateless and powerless with what you term its secularized Western manifestation in the obsession with Israeli power. The history of blood libels with its particular emphasis on Jewish ritual lust for the blood of non-Jewish children, and its secularized version today in news headlines about the idea of killing children. Mm-hmm. Soviet anti-Zionism and the Tsarist protocols of the Elders of Zion on the one hand, and then the current academic discourse on apartheid, racist, colonial Israel on the other. But could you expand a bit for us on those parallels as you see them?
Certainly. It's one of these things that once you see them, it's kind of nearly impossible to unsee them, because once you learn that essential to a certain brand of Christian theology is the notion of Jewish statelessness, powerlessness, because Christianity brought the message of truth. And again, this is where I often struggle to speak with people in the 21st century, because people kind of assume that we live in a live and let live world. And, I have to let people know that much of human history is not like that. So when Christianity claims to have the final truth, it expects people to see the light and to join this new truth. And Jews who have rejected that, and we are by definition, we are the descendants of Jews who rejected that truth. Well, that's a problem. Why do they still exist? A lot of the students, when I say that, they almost cringe when I say that theologically, early Christianity has a problem with the continued existence of Jews. Like, how are they not getting on board with the program? And ultimately, what Christianity develops is a theology that says, you know what? We figured it out. We know why Jews still exist. Jews actually have a role, and the role of the Jews is to remain stateless, powerless, miserable, persecuted, as continued evidence for what happens to those who have rejected the truth of Christ. So what happens is that Jewish powerlessness, misery, persecution, and statelessness become part of the justification of Christianity. It's that baked in. It's not marginal. It's not some small kind of issue. It's baked into the justification. So to that brand of Christianity, and one of the things that we learn about religions in the course is that religions don't disappear. Even when they become secularized, their ideas turn into secular ideas, but they still remain. So, for example, the notion that Jews must remain stateless and powerlessness has become secularized to this obsession with Israeli power, because that's literally a theological challenge that must be put down. I'm of course separately discussing in the course the emerging 17th century theological branch of Christianity that turns pro-Zionist. We talked about ritual bloodlust. So again, when you learn about the blood libels and the notion that it's not just that Jews kill Christian children for blood, it's a ritual, it's a lust. It's something that, again, is inherent to who the Jews are. It defines them. So once you learn about that, and you look at the disproportionate emphasis on Israel, the Israeli military killing non-Jewish children, the notion that this is ritualized, the notion that there is a lust there, that it's not an unfortunate outcome of having to wage an incredibly difficult war in a dense urban setting, in one of what some military experts call the most fortified area in military history. It is presented as the goal, as the deep desire, as expressing the Jewish ritual lust that is of their character. So again, once you see that, I find that it's very difficult to unsee it. And those are the continuities that we look at.
Einat, in your essay, you discuss these different utopian models of political emancipation. You talk about Bundism, you talk about communism. And reading it, I wondered to what extent you consider Zionism to have been a type of utopian solution for the Jewish question. I mean, in some ways, it's very practical. It's about just creating a safe haven. But there's other aspects that are this idea of transforming the diaspora Jew to some new Hebrew, or even, I guess, Herzl's idea that if we have a state, then anti-Semitism will disappear. I wonder to what extent you see Zionism also as a type of utopian solution to the questions that Jews were struggling with.
So you're absolutely right. Zionism always had also that utopian idea. I mean, it was supposed to solve issues, such as the status of Jews around the world. And indeed, Herzl believed that he didn't think that all Jews need to live in the Jewish state. He believed that the mere existence of a Jewish state would resolve the issue of the so-called homelessness. Herzl actually took the anti-Semites at their word. When they said, look, our problem with the Jews is that they're homeless. So Herzl said, fine, then we'll have a home and then they'll have no more problems. And I often reflect on what would he think if he realized that they just found something else that they have a problem with, that now they have a problem with the fact that the Jews do have a home. But yes, there was this idea that Zionism would not just give Jews a state and would allow Jews around the world to walk more confidently among the nations, that it would actually cure the nations of their anti-Semitism. When we read the labor Zionists, especially, they really, more than any other Zionists, they had the vision of transforming the Jewish person, the Jewish soul, into that man who works the land and the sweat kind of goes into the land, and really the antithesis of the pale, frail, powerless Jew. Actually, more than any other brand of Zionism, when we read the texts of labor Zionism, what was remarkable was that they achieved everything they wanted. So you go through their texts, you realize how in real time everything they imagined was absolutely insane, but they achieved all of it. So Zionism is remarkable in its combination of the practical and the utopian. But I don't know if you were referring to that. I also struggle with the notion that what does it mean when it falls short of the utopia? It hasn't cured the world of its obsession with Jews. And, another Hungarian, Ephraim Kishon, said that, yes, the establishment of the state of Israel did not cure the world of its obsession with the Jews, but it gave us the ability to tell the anti-Semites to go to hell. A quite limited ability, but somewhat of an ability. We studied the Satmar Jews, and we study an essay that says, what if the Satmar Jews, the ones who are theologically opposed to the Jews building the modern state of Israel because God is supposed to do it when God decides. What happens if the state of Israel is destroyed in some cataclysmic event? Will they have essentially the last theological laugh? Ultimately, utopias work with history. And if history proves certain utopias wrong, like Bundism and communism and emancipation, certainly in Europe, then they lose their appeal. And when certain utopias at least achieve some of their goals, they continue to have appeal.
I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, if I could just ask a potentially controversial / sensitive question. I think there's if we put kind of Haredim on the side for a moment, there's so many different ideologies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that are supposed to alleviate the situation of Jews. But as you've pointed out, Hitler, Stalin, and others, in some ways, the decision of history in some ways left only two standing. One was Zionism. How do we become safe? We create a state in our historic homeland. And the other one was either we go to America, or even America as a concept, a liberal Western democracy, and that is the way that Jews will remain safe. I wonder to what extent you feel that October the 7th and its aftermath. So what happened here in terms of the very brutal events, massacres, people hiding the sorts of things that we never imagined, on the one hand, for Zionism, and the outburst, even before Israel had actually even responded, the outburst of hatred towards Jews in America and the UK and Australia, etc. If you take Zionism and immigration to America as the successful models of Jewish safety and thriving, to what extent have they taken a hit, do you think, in the last few months? And to what extent maybe Jews need to rethink, or I'm not suggesting throwing them in the bin, but to what extent do we need to maybe reevaluate how to live successful and thriving and safe lives in the 21st century?
That's exactly what October 7th was all about. And this is why it's still happening. That was, in fact, the purpose of October 7th. And I know that people fear to talk about it, but that is exactly what it is. Because, some people say, what was Hamas thinking? Or what was Yahya Sinwar thinking? Didn't he realize that Israel has superior military capability? And I'm saying he knew exactly what he was doing. For years, I gave a talk about the history of the Jewish state, the history of Zionism. And one of the things that I would say in that talk is that anti-Zionists understand Israel and Zionism better than anyone, because they understand that this is the source of our strength. They understand that it's not about the airplanes or the tanks. It's not about the economy. It's not even about our people. It's about the idea. In the name of the idea of Jewish self-determination, Jews were willing to sacrifice and fight and move from prestigious European universities to become farmers in the heat of the Galilee. And that idea was inspiring. And that idea ultimately inspired America and American Jews. I mean, it's not that America is really an alternative to Zionism. It works with it. It's not a coincidence that the country that is most welcoming to Jewish life is also the one that is pro-Zionist, supportive of Israel. These things work together. So what Hamas was working on achieving on October 7th was essentially to go to the core of the source of the strength of Israel, and that is the idea of Zionism. Precisely what you described. Their notion was to recreate the pogrom in the shtetl, meaning the notion that the Jews will be defenseless. That's why they chose a particular date when the army typically stands down. This is why they went first, to ensure that the army couldn't defend. They go to the homes, the brutality, the glee. All of it was to basically send the Jews back to pre-state and pre-Zionist years, to say, everything you've built is worthless. You think you are able to achieve dignity for yourselves, safety. We will show that the only kind of Jew that we are ever willing to accept is the one that is powerless, stateless, and at our mercy. Worse, we know, just as for the last century, we know that whenever we butcher Jews, we will have the backing of whatever anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic ideology is prevalent at the moment. Nazis in the 30s and 40s, Pan-Arabists in the 50s and 60s, communists in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, jihadists in the 90s and early 2000s, Shiite jihadists right now, and Western communists, what I would call militant progressivism. Every anti-Jewish ideology will have our back, which means that Jews in America will feel that they are unsafe because they have a state. And they will also be forced to understand that there is only one way for Jews to live: stateless, powerless, and at the mercy of others. This is what I think is going on. I think nothing less than that is taking place. And this is still very much the battle. And you're right, it is leading to question if our enemies are telling us that the only kind of Jew that they will ever accept is stateless, powerless, and at their mercy. Is that really the only choice that we are facing? Or can we still insist on our right to equality, to dignity, to sovereignty?
Einat, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for joining us. I urge our viewers and our readers to read the original essay that we're discussing here today, Zionism as Therapy. It's a fascinating and an urgently necessary read, I think. And yeah, I'm particularly struck by this almost, yeah, the therapy of reading Zionism in its original form. I can hardly endorse it as an outsider. It was Herzl and Pinsker and Smolensky and Lillian Bloom. These were the people who taught me this idea. So I think it's good medicine for all of us. Einat, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.